She had been covering Middle Eastern politics for nearly 2 decades when he first noticed the pattern. It was during a university symposium at Harvard in 2018 where he sat among some of the West's most respected foreign policy minds discussing the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The conversation followed predictable lines: security concerns, historical grievances, religious fundamentalism, American influence. But something nagged at him as he listened to these brilliant scholars dissect the region with surgical precision. Their analysis, for all its sophistication, seemed to miss something fundamental. They spoke of Israel as though it were an aberration, a uniquely problematic state that defied normal diplomatic solutions. They treated it as an outlier in the international system, a rogue democracy that somehow managed to survive despite violating every principle of liberal governance they held sacred. But what if they had it backwards? What if Israel wasn't the exception to Western democratic norms, but their logical conclusion under extreme pressure? What if the discomfort the West felt when looking at Israel had nothing to do with Israel itself and everything to do with what they saw reflected back at them? This is the story of that mirror and why the Western world has spent 7 decades trying desperately not to look into it. The standard narrative about Israel in Western intellectual circles follows a familiar script. It portrays Israel as a state trapped in perpetual crisis, sustained only by American aid and technological superiority, governed by right-wing extremists who have abandoned the liberal democratic values of its founding. This narrative suggests that Israel represents everything wrong with nationalism, militarism, and ethnic particularism in the modern world. But this comfortable story obscures a far more unsettling reality. Israel is not an aberration from Western democratic values. It is their purest expression under existential pressure. It is what every Western democracy might become if faced with the same impossible choices between survival and moral purity. The revelation came to him during his first extended stay in Tel Aviv in 2019. He had arrived expecting to find the garrison state of Western imagination, militaristic, paranoid, closed off from the world. Instead, he discovered one of the most dynamic, innovative societies on Earth, the same country that maintained one of the world's most sophisticated intelligence operations, also led the world in startup density. The same society that imposed strict security measures also maintained a raucous, chaotic, democratic culture that made American political discourse seem polite by comparison. This was the first paradox. How could a state supposedly consumed by security concerns simultaneously produce more technological innovation per capita than anywhere else on Earth? How could a society living under constant threat maintain one of the world's most vibrant civil societies, with human rights organizations that regularly challenged government policy in ways that would be unthinkable in truly authoritarian states? The answer lay not in Israeli exceptionalism, but in Western misunderstanding. The West had been reading Israel through the lens of its own comfortable assumptions about how democracies should behave. They expected liberal democracies to be gentle, consensus-driven, allergic to the use of force. When Israel failed to conform to this template, Western observers concluded it must be fundamentally different, fundamentally flawed. But this expectation revealed more about Western privilege than Israeli pathology. The Western democratic experience had been shaped by extraordinary historical luck, geographic isolation, abundant resources, weak neighbors, and the absence of existential threats. For 75 years, Western Europeans and North Americans had lived in a bubble of security that allowed them to develop elaborate theories about international law, human rights, and peaceful conflict resolution. Israel existed outside that bubble. It was what Western democracy looked like when stripped of comfortable illusions, forced to confront the basic realities of state survival that the West had forgotten. This created what he came to think of as the anxiety mirror effect. When Western observers looked at Israel, they saw not an alien society, but a funhouse mirror reflection of their own democratic systems under stress. They saw what their own countries might look like if stripped of geographic advantages and forced to make impossible choices between liberal values and physical survival. The mirror was particularly disturbing because it suggested that Western moral authority might be more fragile than anyone wanted to admit. If gentle, consensus-driven democracy was only possible under conditions of extraordinary security, what did that say about the universal applicability of Western values? These questions became more pressing as Western societies began to face new forms of stress. The rise of China challenged Western economic supremacy. Immigration challenged cultural homogeneity. Under these pressures, Western democracies began displaying the same characteristics they had condemned in Israel: rising nationalism, security state expansion, erosion of civil liberties. The 2010 election of Donald Trump marked a watershed moment. Americans found themselves in a democracy that looked uncomfortably similar to the Israeli system they had criticized: polarized, militaristic, contemptuous of international opinion. Brexit had a similar effect. The country that had lectured Israel about international law abandoned the European Union in nationalist populism. Intellectuals who had criticized Israeli tribalism watched their own society fracture. Israel, rather than being an outlier, began to look prophetic. It had simply arrived at the destination toward which all stressed democracies were heading: a system that maintained democratic forms while adapting them to the requirements of continuous competition and threat. This reframing explained many puzzles. Why did Israeli society remain dynamic despite living under siege? Because siege conditions accelerated innovation by forcing rapid adaptation. Why did Israeli democracy remain robust despite security state characteristics? Because Israeli citizens, living with real consequences for political decisions, maintained higher civic engagement than Western counterparts. The anxiety mirror effect explained Western emotional reactions to Israeli policy. The intensity of criticism directed at Israel far exceeded anything aimed at objectively worse actors because Israel's actions carried an implicit threat to Western self-understanding. When Israel used force to maintain security, it suggested that all the elaborate international institutions developed by the West might be luxuries available only to those in secure neighborhoods. When Israel prioritized ethnic solidarity over liberal universalism, it suggested that the multicultural idealism promoted by Western elites might collapse under pressure. When Israel dismissed international criticism and pursued its own strategic interests, it suggested that the rule-based international order might be less robust than its architects claimed. These implications were so threatening to Western intellectual frameworks that many observers preferred to treat Israel as a unique pathology rather than confront what its example might mean for their own societies. But the mirror was becoming harder to ignore. As Western societies faced increasing pressures, Israeli-style adaptations began to seem less pathological and more prescient. The same security measures that seemed oppressive when implemented by Israel began appearing in Western airports, borders, and urban centers. This convergence pointed toward an uncomfortable conclusion. Perhaps Western criticism of Israel had never really been about Israeli behavior. Perhaps it had always been about Western anxiety over their own capacity for similar behavior under similar circumstances. The anxiety mirror revealed that behind decades of moral posturing lay a deeper fear, that liberal democracy might be more fragile than anyone wanted to admit, that faced with real threats, Western societies might abandon their cherished principles just as readily as any other civilization. Israel's crime was not violating Western values, but embodying them too clearly. It showed what those values looked like when tested by reality, rather than preserved in academic theory. It demonstrated that liberal democracy might be less a universal achievement than a luxury available only to those powerful enough to enforce its conditions. This perspective suggested that rather than learning lessons from Israel, the West was learning about itself. The discomfort Western observers felt when looking at Israeli society was the discomfort of recognition. They were seeing themselves stripped of illusions. The mirror would only become more relevant as the 21st century unfolded, and the privileged position that had allowed Western societies to develop their elaborate moral theories came under increasing pressure. In that future, Israel might prove to have been not an aberration from Western democratic development, but a preview of what all democracies must become to survive in an uncertain world.